Okay, welcome to this webinar, Connecting Questions to Answers. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Dwayne Brown, and I am the Deputy Director on the Common Education Data Standards Initiative. We will be recording this webinar and posting on our community site for others who are not able to join us at this time. So, quick overview of kind of the format. As we go through the webinar, if you have questions, feel free to put those in the chat box, and I'll address them as we go. I may hold some until later if it will be covered later in the presentation, and I may wait until the end depending on time available to answer any of the questions that come into the chat box. Quick synopsis of my background. I worked for 8.5 years for the Oklahoma State Department of Education, wearing many hats before coming to work on the CEDS initiative this past August. I served as a business and technical analyst for their student level data collection. I worked on their SLDS grant. I connected directly with 13 different student information system vendors to work with them who supplied the data from the LEAs to the state live daily via the SIF standard. That's the Schools Interoperability Framework. I also worked on mapping their data for an EdFi project and for a CEDS project and designed portions of their state and federal reporting systems. So I've got lots of experience working with data in a state, and with that experience, also I have lots of encounters with frustrations when working with data. So I understand where a lot of you may be coming from. And one of the big frustrations that I felt in about the last 4 years I had been working there was having so much valuable data and not enough time to use it. I saw the potential that CEDS had to help transform those frustrations into some form of joy, at least joy for data people and how data people understand joy. And so I came to help work with CEDS just under a year ago to help find resources and help to make those resources beneficial for states to be able to use that data in other ways. So the webinar today is going to go over the process that pretty much anyone who collects and uses data goes through, and will demonstrate some tools CEDS has to assist in improving that process. So all data collections, all data use, data collection, data reporting, whether at the local, state, or federal level, can be summed up basically in one phrase: questions to answers. The questions being asked by those who require data collection or by those who need data are questions like how many, right? How many students are chronically absent? How many students are limited English proficient English language learners? How many teachers do we have that are highly qualified? How many teachers do we have in a classroom with how many students? Many times the requests come in either through a new law or to investigate a current situation from legislators, and those questions are basically how many. So we get a lot of how many questions from various different sources. Many data requests, open record requests that come in, they're asking the question how many. The requester then turns that how many in their own way into answers. Then a lot of times it's their own interpretation of the answers, but they turn it into answers either way. Other questions asked could require analysis, such as the second one there. What impact does program X have on, and then you fill in the blank. Legislators tend to ask those types of questions when they're looking at funding or defunding certain programs. And then there are questions that may be asked at the local level by teachers, by administrators, such as what score did student A receive on his most recent formative or summative assessment? And teachers utilize data by asking questions to inform their instruction. Administrators in schools utilize the data by asking questions to improve schools as a whole. Regardless, whenever data is collected, it's generally collected because someone has a question and they're seeking an answer. So now, what we don't have to agree on, and we will probably not agree on this call or ever, is the purpose of the question or the analysis process used to get the answer. Those items are highly contested and debated, and we are certainly not going to attempt to cover anything related to that today. The purpose of the question, for instance, may be to defund a program, and there may be some who disagree with the amount of data used, the way it was used to determine the answer, so we're simply going to avoid that conversation today. It is possible to agree on, or at least get close to agreeing on, are the data elements needed to answer the question as proposed by the one who's requesting the data, if we're supplying the data necessary to answer it through the process that that person has developed. So they define it, they decide what the question is going to be, they decide the data that they need, and they explain that to us, and then we're able to provide that data back to them. Whether we agree with the results or not, that's a whole other question, that's a whole other story. But defining out what somebody is asking for and being able to supply that is what we're going to take a look at today. So they say, I need X data to answer this question. We may answer back, that's not enough data, or it's the wrong data to answer that question. They may disagree, and so we provide the data that they asked for. But we still understood what they were asking for and what they needed to do it their own way. So looking at the process at a high level, I know that I have gone through, and I know many of you have probably gone through as well, we usually have to start by clarifying the question and the answer that the person requesting the data is hoping to get. Very often the question is vague. The process they are hoping to go through to get the answer is vague. They have not filled in enough blanks to adequately determine the data necessary to provide, to get the answer. And so we generally have to go and get clarification, and so that we can determine the data elements needed to provide what they're looking for. We need to know where those elements originate and make sure that the source of those elements contain elements and definitions that are understood to fulfill the requirements of the question. So we generally have to go through and get a lot of clarification. When we get the question and we get information about the answer they're trying to seek, a lot of clarification goes into that, a lot of resources. So, example of a common type of question asked, for instance, at the state education agency level. The State Department of Education will report the total number of students in grades 3 through 8 who participated in programs X, Y, and Z, disaggregated by race, ethnicity, sex, economic status, and state assessment proficiency levels for reading and math. So there's a lot of questions being asked inside of that. Maybe that came from a legislator. Maybe they want to know that information. Maybe that's in law, and the legislation came down and they want to know that particular information. So there's questions being asked here. From the surface, basically the questions are how many? How many students are in these programs? How many are in grades 3 through 8? How many are of this race? How many are of this ethnicity? How many are of this economic status? How many got this particular assessment level? That's at the surface. So it's basically some how many questions. There are also underlying questions that are being asked here that we need to know a little bit more about in order to get the data correct that the legislator needs. There's funding questions inside of this possibly. There are program effectiveness questions sitting inside of these how many questions. There is an indication possibly in here that some level of research may be done to determine funding or determine impact or determine whatever. So we have to determine what's missing here. Do they want it by the program only? Do they also want it at the LEA and school level? They didn't ask for it at the LEA and school level, but is that something that they're going to ask for and that was just left out? Is this a state as a whole? Did they happen to leave that kind of information out? They also didn't define participation very well. So we have in grades 3 through 8 who participated in programs X, Y, and Z. When you're dealing with those who are requesting data, I'm sure those of you who have dealt with this have gone through that, where what does participation mean? Is participation 1 day? Is participation 5 days? Is it all year in that program? Is it multiple years in that program? I'm sure if we continue to look, we could find more missing information that we would need to accurately explain the questions and the answers process. But a lot of times what we get begins at this level. It seems clear, but as we begin to dig into the data, and as we begin to try to identify the elements, and as we try to figure out the answer they're trying to get or the answers they're trying to get, we discovered that we're missing a lot more of the questions that are behind this and a lot more of the answers and the process that are behind this particular statement here. They think they know what they're asking, but they may not entirely know what they're looking for. So digging in a little bit more. So there's basically a process we go through. We first get the question that they asked. The elements needed to answer that question then are defined, and it's best to define them at the granular level because that is where they originate. So we may have aggregate numbers, but where did those aggregate numbers come from? They originated from a particular data element, and we need to understand that data element at that granular level, at the source level, so that we understand the aggregate numbers so that we can provide correct data over to who's going to be using it. We also need to determine how the element will be used to answer the question, sometimes resulting in discovering more data elements are actually needed. In that other example there, maybe they left out the LEAs. And so now we need the LEA information, the school information. They left out defining participation, so we actually need participation definitions. We need to understand the entry dates and the exit dates of participation in programs. And so when we go through the process of understanding that, we may discover more data elements are needed or different data elements are needed to actually answer the question. So it's a process that we go through right there, often with those who are requesting the data, the legislator, the program office, the researcher, open records request, whoever it may be that's requesting the particular data. It's also important to understand the source system elements and definitions. If the data is moved from one system to another and it's transformed along the way, is the intent of the question and the answer fulfilled in the data used? Could the transformation of the data along the way have changed the meaning? Do the users who input the data into the source system ever connect with the data after it's been transformed to verify that the definitions and the use are aligned with what it was transformed from? So we receive data from LEAs, we may get the data coming in from LEAs, then we transform it into a standard at the state. Do they review that transformed data? And then that data is handed out. So the primary data source and those elements and where it originates need to be defined and need to align with the actual data that's going to be used to answer the question. And then finally, the elements used in the second step to determine the data needed to answer the question need to be aligned with the data elements in the source system. So at the state level, in the second step there, we may have defined a list of elements that we're going to use, but those elements may not align exactly to what the LEA perhaps collects or some other institution. Wherever it's collected at the local level, it may not actually be aligned. So there needs to be alignment with those particular elements. There could be, for LEAs, for instance, multiple disparate data systems that contain similar but different element names and definitions. So all of those source systems need to be aligned to a common set of elements, which were defined in the second step to ensure consistency and accuracy in reporting. So making sure that we have all of the same information. So how do you maintain or begin the process of ensuring consistency in data requests, common element definitions, and the ability to align source systems with those elements? That's where CEDS can come in and can begin to help you with that process. CEDS has a tool called Connect. It provides a standard template for communicating the question and the method for gathering the answer. The Connect tool is linked to a comprehensive set of elements and definitions and option sets that are common across the P20 workforce education environment. And the Align and My Connect tools allow the user to link the connection and the elements that they identified in the connection with their own data dictionary aligned to CEDS. And this basically then shows the relationships between the disparate elements and the systems that are collected, and it uses the CEDS standard as the bridge to show those relationships. It can also help to identify missing elements in the data collection. The legislative requirement may require a new collection of elements to provide the answer. So starting here, the Connect tool allows you to start with a list of all the elements needed, and then you work backwards to determine, well, this legislative requirement came down, here's all the elements we need to answer the question, here's all the elements we have. We're missing 3 elements to be able to answer this question. That's going to require a new collection or an addition to a current collection that we have to be able to get that data in so that we can use it to answer the questions that exist here in the legislation. So we're going to take a look at the CEDS Connect tool, just a brief look, and how to create a connection inside of that. The template inside of the Connect tool provides several fields for addressing the question and answer analysis as well as the data elements. This is what the Connect tool basically looks like. The header information of the Connect tool is a location where the general question is asked. Contains general information, who's the author, what's the title of it, so that you can reference it later on, the source who's creating it, and then a general description of the connection. What is the question that we are trying to answer here? What is the collection about? It also contains descriptors which provide multiple categories for cataloging the connection and the purpose of the connection. So there's various different reasons why you may have a question. There's lots of different questions, and this helps to actually catalog those questions. The questions that are cataloged would be useful, for instance, for research-based questions and answers about a particular subject such as the impact of poverty on education. So connections, the reason we have the cataloging is that connections can be made private for internal use at a state or LEA level, or whoever wants to use that, they can keep those connections private. But they can also be made public when that particular question, such as a research question, and the analysis work that would go into getting that answer in the process, if that would be beneficial to multiple users who want to replicate that process with their own data, then the creator of that connection can make it public so that everybody can see, well, this is the question, this is the method they use to get the answers, here are the data elements that they would use to process the information. I want to see how that would work with my own data, so they can connect and use their own data to actually create that particular question and answer scenario. And the CEDS Connect tool contains several different connections. It contains file specification information about EdFacts. It contains questions from researchers, questions about chronic absenteeism, and how various different individuals have gone about defining those particular questions and defining how they answer that and the data elements that they would use to actually answer that particular question. And so as CEDS continues, more and more connections are being added and published that allow for anybody to come in and utilize that particular tool to see how others have defined those questions and answers. The template also provides then the location for adding data elements needed to answer the question at the granular level. And this is where the tool begins to become more effective. So anybody can write down the question and they can write down information about the question, but when it becomes effective is actually adding in those particular data elements. The tool is linked to the extensive Common Education Data Standard elements and definitions. So when you go in, you add your question, and you can add the answer information and the analysis work, but you actually individually check mark the particular elements that would be necessary to answer that question. And you'll see in a second how that is beneficial. So it's linked to the CEDS elements and definitions, and when you're considering elements to add, such as like the student's name or the state identifier, those are elements that are needed, but you can also add in things like timing constraints. So they would be taken into account when answering questions like school year, entry dates, exit dates. The example we had before related to program participation in various programs and state assessment results. Those are time-based, so they may want to know the participation, but they may want to know participation ever, or they may want to know participation by year. And so then you would have to have program entry and program exit dates, and all those various different things would come into play in trying to understand the data that's necessary to actually answer that particular question. So this tool allows you to create an extensive list of all of the elements that would be needed to determine the answer. Then we have the analysis recommendations and provides a location for how the elements that were previously listed would be used to get the answer. So it has functionality to allow you to create multiple sections of recommendations to organize the structure. Other information as well that exists in there can be added to connections, such as related connections. You may have two or more connections that deal with the same collection, but in different ways, and these can be related together. References can be added as well as comments or additional information from the author. The connection can then, as I mentioned before, be made publicly available, or it can be shared privately with other users for internal purposes. The key to connecting all of this together, as I mentioned, is the list of data elements. So when a common set of data elements have been applied to the connection, indicating that these list of elements that would be required to answer the question, that's where the other tools, MyConnect and Align, can then be used. So MyConnect, that tool, it's on there, allows you to compare a private connection that you own with a published data dictionary you own, or it allows you to compare a public connection that anybody owns with a private data dictionary that you own. So there's various different ways that you can utilize it, but you have to have a published connection or a published data dictionary for you to be able to utilize the tool. To use MyConnect, you would need to have an Align map. And so let's take a look real quick here. Align is another tool that we're not going to go into great detail today, but basically it allows you to store your data dictionary metadata information, not the actual data itself, but the metadata. So you have your element names. These are your names, how you call the data. You may call it, you know, student's race. Somebody else may just call it race. So you have your own element names, you have your own database name where those elements are stored, you have your own table name, your element definitions, your data types, your comments, your notes about your data elements, your option sets. All of that is put inside of a line, and it's based off of how your standard is set up. So you imagine you have a state education agency, they have a particular standard. You have a higher ed, post-secondary, they have a particular standard for how they store data and what they call it. You have all of your different LEAs, you have early childhood programs, you have workforce in relation to education, you have various different systems that have all of their own structures for how they store data. They can put their particular data dictionary, their element names inside of the Align tool. Then the Align tool provides you the ability to align those data dictionaries with a common data dictionary, with a common education data standards, elements, and definitions. So if you have higher ed aligns to CEDS and the Department of Education aligns to CEDS, now you've got a bridge between higher ed and the Department of Education. If early childhood programs align to CEDS, now you have a bridge from higher education to early childhood and from Department of Education to early childhood. So there's various different means where you're creating that bridge of those data elements from one system to CEDS and then from system to system using CEDS. So the Align tool allows you to bring alignment between those various different systems by merging and aligning on a single particular standard, which is the Common Education Data Standard. So when you take an existing connection that contains the elements needed to answer the proposed connection and you use MyConnect, it compares then the elements with your own, and it provides you with a list of your own elements that would be needed to fulfill the data requirements of the connection. This helps you identify the source data needed and provides information related to potential gaps and missing data that would need to be collected. So if we're looking on the screen here, basically from a particular connection that exists related to military connected students, the CEDS indicator is military connected student indicator. And then there's an example of the mapped elements. The source system, their own system of a particular state, has something related to Armed Forces indicator, National Guard indicator, and Reserve indicator. And all of those link over to the CEDS military connected student indicator. And so it allows that bridge to go over to CEDS so that others would be able to see if you had a particular connection or a question related to the military connected student indicator, that question could go into Connect. Somebody could ask the question, they could identify military connected student indicators what is needed as one of the elements, and then when you run MyConnect, because you want to have that same question or you want to have an answer to that question, you would get the result showing your particular system's indicators, your particular system's elements, which in this case for that state are Armed Forces, National Guard, and Reserve indicators. And so it provides that bridge between those two. So we're going to walk through a sample use case here, and we're actually going to do it related to ESFA and that reporting requirement that I had just shown related to military connected student. So the legislation in ESFA requires the collection of an indicator for a student with a parent who is a member of the Armed Forces on active duty. So taking this through the process, what is the question that's being asked here is what we want to look at. And we go back to the legislation. Basically, we're looking for the answer of which students have a parent who is a member of the Armed Forces on active duty. That's at the surface level, pretty basic. It's probably a how many count, right? How many kids are on active duty and how many are not. But at the highest level, that is the particular question is which students have a parent who's a member of the Armed Forces on active duty. You have to be able to answer that particular question. Then we have the particular data elements that are needed to answer this. And in simple terms, it's really just identifying the student and having an indicator on the student about a parent who's active duty in the Armed Forces. So we need data elements related to a student and that student having a parent that's on active duty. CEDS contains an indicator like this, as I had shown in that previous example. And it contains, for instance, not military connected, active duty, National Guard or Reserve, or unknown. And those are the option sets that are available for this particular indicator. So it's an indication the student's parent or guardian is on active duty in the National Guard, or in the reserve components of the United States military services. For this particular one, it would actually be active duty that would apply. So if the student has not military connected, National Guard or Reserve or unknown, then at that point it would not apply to that particular student. But if they have active duty as that, then that legislation would apply for that student in that count. So the basic elements needed would be the student identifier, the identification system, such as state identification systems, so that you know which ID you're using, and then you would also have the military connected student indicator. But that's not nearly extensive enough to capture all the information that would be needed to answer the question the way it will need to be answered. For instance, enrollment information, entry and exit dates would be needed at the granular level to ensure the student is actually enrolled the year it would be reported. The school the student is enrolled in, that's other information that's going to be needed. Information that needs to be tied to other things related to assessment performance, so that information needs to be collected as well. There's an extensive amount of elements that would guide us to timing for the indicator, the location of the student. So let's take a look now at the analysis process. So those are the basic elements there in step 2 that are identified, but there are a lot more elements that would go into this particular question related to what they're actually asking in the legislation. It's not just asking how many kids are military connected, it's in relation to so many other elements, at what school, at what time, during what year. And so there's a lot of other elements that come into play to answer that question. When we're taking a look at the analysis, there are still some things that need to be clarified. For instance, we're looking here at the legislation, and we have a student with a parent who's a member of the armed forces on active duty, and that's pretty much what we're looking for in the legislation. But how is parent defined? Is parent limited? Would legal guardian be counted as well? Those are questions that that would go back to who is asking this particular question, which is actually the Department of Education. So is it just parent, or is it also legal guardian? So things like that. We also are looking at when is a student military connected. We have the elements for entry and exit date for enrollment, but at what point in time should the indicator be collected? If the parent's on active duty in the armed forces on September 15th, but is not on active duty in the armed forces on April 30th, when the student is being assessed, are they military connected? What if the parent left active duty on April 29th, the day before they were assessed? All right, so what data is available to collect this? How should it be collected to allow for accuracy and consistency in reporting the answer to the question? Answers to those particular those questions there will actually influence the data elements that are necessary, and it will clarify the connection. So when answers like that actually do come down, and they're not down yet, but they will be coming down from the Department of Ed, as feedback is provided to them and questions are made and clarified, we will actually get answers related to that. And when answers related to that come in, it determines the data elements that are necessary to actually answer the question. So it becomes a more extensive list and a more accurate list of data elements needed to answer the particular question. Based on the legislation, we have the questions and the elements, but we're not entirely sure yet on how it will be used, and expectations on clarifications of definitions and timing, we would need further clarification. This is where the CEDS Connect tool related to this legislation would provide benefit. The legislation provides the question. The elements are pretty well defined, but more information is needed to clarify how the question will be answered, which may expose more elements needed or identify some elements that are not yet needed. So the analysis section of CEDS in the Connect tool can provide a location for extensive information about the answer, and it can provide a central location in CEDS for multiple users who need that information to go and be informed. So it would inform the states, it would inform the LEAs, and everyone would have access to that particular location. And we are working on publishing out a particular connection related to that, which will expand out as those questions are answered. And so there would be something related to the military connection. The one asking the question, in this case, basically the Department of Education can provide that extensive analysis information that we would need. Then we have the primary data source, which in this case, for this particular use case, is the actual local education agency. It's the LEAs, the districts. So LEAs across the country are going to have to report this particular information. LEAs have a large number of disparate data collections. So on a large scale, how can we assure that LEAs across the country are given a common set of elements to start with and aligned to their own collection processes? How can we ensure they receive a common understanding of the elements and definitions and a common set of guidelines for collecting the data, knowing the analysis work that will be foundational to the collection? When communicating to LEAs or any other local source of data collection, there's often a need to communicate in a common way. And unfortunately, what tends to happen, and I know I'm guilty of all of this as well, having worked in the state, the communication that goes out from state agencies or federal agencies is not always aligned within itself. So one program office may refer to an element and definition one way, while another program office refers to it in a completely different way, and they both issue out requirements for collections that are going to be coming into the state. And so that leaves the source system users, in this instance the LEAs, with the enormous task of having to understand multiple collection terminology and vocabulary, various different data element names and various different data element definitions. And what the CEDS Connect tool and the Common Education Data Standards does as a tool, it uses a tool that can be used to simplify that explanation process, or could be provided in addition to the current process to help provide a common set of guidelines out to LEAs. So from the federal, a common set of guidelines using CEDS down to the states, and from the states, a common set of guidelines down to the LEAs all through CEDS and through those tools. All right, so once those common elements are done, we've identified the source system. The source data now needs to be aligned to the elements and definitions provided over in the second step. So at the LEAs, maybe you have one single LEA student information system, maybe you have disparate systems. Regardless, there's disparate systems everywhere in every state from agency to agency. So the disparate source data systems exist. The agency collecting the data and defining the requirements cannot communicate those requirements in 12 different ways. So if you had 12 different LEA systems sitting out there, you're not going to create a guideline for each one of those 12 different systems. You're going to create a guideline, you're going to create a document, you're going to create information about the collection, and you're going to hand it out in some type of standard, and then you're going to give it to the LEAs or to whoever to be able to report the information back up to the state. So you will use a standard, but will it be a common standard that could be used and could be expanded upon from multiple different agencies? So you will have one way that you'll actually communicate the information, and CEDS Connect does provide a means for communicating that in a standard way and through a standard vocabulary. So it gives you a way that LEAs could align to their systems to CEDS, and the state could align their systems to CEDS, and you communicate information out in that way using that vocabulary and that terminology. Then better data would be expected to come in because better understanding and clarification has gone out. CEDS, so a lot of questions that actually come in to an agency that collects data. So you, and I know this, I've felt it coming in when I worked in Oklahoma. There was a lot of data requests from various different places. You get data requests, you get open records requests, you get research requests, you get state and federal legislative requests, you get state and federal laws that change the collections and need to understand what those are. You have program offices internally requesting data from different IT departments or from each other. You have agency-to-agency requests. You have higher ed needing data from the Department of Education. You have higher ed needing data from workforce. You have workforce needing data from higher ed. You have workforce needing data from the Department of Education. You have early childhood. So you have a lot of data requests. You have a lot of MOUs of data going back and forth. If you think through all of those, or if you experienced questions needing data from all of those, which I'm guessing many of you on the call have, I would guess in most instances there's not a standard process across all of them for requesting data and for providing data back out. That's just a guess, but I know because having been in Oklahoma, there was not a standard process. And so what does that mean? If there's not a standard tool, there's not a standard vocabulary, that means an extensive amount of resources are being spent interpreting the question, the answer, and the elements needed to answer that particular question. So a large amount of information of resources is being spent just trying to interpret the request. So what CEDS provides is a standard template that requests can go into, linked to a common set of vocabulary elements definitions and option sets and tools to align those with the data dictionaries that exist internally. So and the output then is a report using CEDS as a bridge that provides the location and the data elements in your local system that can be used to answer the question. So if you had open records requests all being translated through the lens of the Common Education Data Standards, and research requests in state and federal legislation, internal program offices, agency to agency, if they all had align maps and they were able to then have a comparison with their particular data dictionaries, they keep their own data dictionaries, but they have them aligned to CEDS, and then CEDS became the bridge for making data requests in that terminology using that vocabulary, you would have a system that would allow you to get most everything aligned and provide you with maybe 80 to 90% in a report that gives you most of the elements and how they align, leaving you with a lot less work having to go through and try to figure out how does this element align? What does that mean over on higher ed side? What does that mean? What are they actually asking for in the data request? What's the researcher actually asking for? These are the particular elements. Okay, I understand them in a common vocabulary. Now, how do I take that? I take that, I compare it to my align map. Now I understand the request up against my own data and in my own systems, in my own tables, in my own columns where they exist inside of our own data. So CEDS provides that benefit to you and basically provides all of that at no cost. You can use the tools that exist on the CEDS website. And it generally requires a login. It does require a login to actually add things, but the login is only so that you can track your own information. So there's no cost to actually logging in and using CEDS tools. It just allows you to keep track, and so you can go back in and edit your connections. You can go back in and edit your align maps, and so it stores it to your user account so that you're able to make those modifications. All right, that basically concludes how to use the CEDS Connect tool to connect questions to answers. Are there any questions out there? I will take a look in the chat box, and as you type, or if you type, I will go ahead and put up some of the contact information. The website where the tools are located is ceds.ed.gov, and like I said, you can actually go out there and under tools, you can choose Align, you can choose Connect, and you can actually take a look without having to log in at some of the Align maps that states and various different agencies have published showing their data dictionaries. You can also take a look at various connections that have been published that have varying amounts of analysis inside of them, and it shows the elements there. We also have a community, which is ceds.grad360.org, and that is basically a discussion location where you can discuss, has some resources there, has some different videos. This will be posted there at that location for you to look through, but it's a community where you can post a discussion if you have questions about anything, and you can work with the community on that. CEDS.ed.gov has an actual place where you can submit questions and comments directly to CEDS team members. And then Grad360 is where you can actually work with the community to see what other states or LEAs may be doing. And then, of course, we have Twitter if you want to follow or you happen to tweet. And my contact information is there. Feel free to email me directly about anything CEDS related or any questions you may have had from this particular presentation. I would be happy to speak with you directly or work with you. We do provide technical assistance to states. We help them if they have data dictionaries that are not aligned to CEDS and they need some help doing that. We, in some instances, will actually do the bulk of the work to actually align those maps for them so that they have the information there, because we know resources are limited in states. And so we have that ability to provide some technical assistance to help with that at the level that you are interested. We do have one question. We have a clarification, actually. You have to have a published connection and map to use My Connect. There we go. The published connection, you can apply any published map. If you don't publish the connection, you can only apply your published maps. So that's a clarification to make sure I get information right. So you would need a published connection and map to actually use the My Connect tool. So we got that clarified there. Any other questions? Not seeing any questions at this time. I want to thank everyone for attending and hope that you all have a great day. Thanks.